The late Rousas Rushdoony had a vision for this country and the world that was very extreme. He wrote some 30 books and founded the Christian Reconstruction movement to reconstruct American society to conform to Old Testament biblical law. His Institutes for Biblical Law are a 3-volume, 1,600-page seminal work on the application of the Ten Commandments to modern society. He calls on Christ's elect people to subdue all things and all nations to Christ and His law word. Rushdoony advocates the death penalty for anyone who sins against the Ten Commandments. Among the usual suspects, such as homosexuals or anyone involved in abortion, his list includes blasphemers, adulterers, disobedient children, many other people. Although Reconstructionism may seem so far out as to be easily dismissed, the philosophy has in fact provided the intellectual basis for much of the religious right's thinking and political activism. Professor William Martin, chair of the Department of Sociology at Rice University, conducted interviews with more than 100 leaders of the religious right, including many Christian Reconstructionists. He published a book which became a documentary for PBS called With God on Our Side. Professor Martin envisions a reconstructed America. He explains that the federal government would recede into the background and churches would assume responsibility for welfare and education, and the Constitution would conform to biblical law. This view of the law has an interesting take on women, often quoted as a passage from Ephesians of the New Testament. Wives, submit to your own husband as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church. According to biblical law, then, the woman should be subordinate to the man. Dominion theology is not based in any particular religious denomination. Its followers come from all denominations or non-denominational churches. It is a belief that Christians have a holy responsibility, a mandate, a commission to take dominion over the world. The term dominion means control over, in this case, control over all the democratic institutions that govern our country. Dominionists view homosexuality as a criminal activity. This movement does not want to just ban gay marriage. They want to make gay relationships illegal. In other words, homosexuality should be a crime. Senator Santorum, talking about the Texas anti-sodomy laws, which the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional in June of 2003, said, "If the Supreme Court says you have the right to consensual sex in your own home, then you have the right to bigamy, you have the right to polygamy, you have the right to incest, you have the right to adultery." Well, if homosexuals and adulterers don't have the right to consensual sex in their own homes, then they're criminals, and criminals go to prison. In this interview, Santorum sounds like a Christian Reconstructionist, wanting to criminalize both homosexuality and adultery. There's a major roadblock for those wanting to take dominion over the U.S. government, and that's the U.S. Constitution. The man considered to be the father of the Constitution, James Madison, wrote, "Strongly guarded is the separation between religion and government in the Constitution of the United States." Another founding father, Thomas Jefferson, went on to become this country's 3rd president. He used the metaphor wall of separation between church and state to explain the meaning of the First Amendment. In order for dominionists to fulfill their Great Commission, Jefferson's wall must come down, and they're working hard at it. The Constitution Restoration Act was introduced into both houses of Congress on February 11, 2004. It includes the acknowledgement of God as the sovereign source of law. This is important because God is never mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. The framers of the Constitution wrote a secular document, or a godless constitution, as scholars call it. So the acknowledgement that God is the sovereign source of law is a big departure from the intentions of our founding fathers. The Constitution Restoration Act threatens with impeachment and conviction any judge who dares to uphold church-state separation. Placing the Ten Commandments in public building has great symbolic value. It represents the supremacy of the Bible over the United States Constitution. This 2,581-pound monument of the Ten Commandments was placed in the lobby of the Alabama Supreme Court. The federal courts ruled it unconstitutional. It violated the separation of church and state, and they had it removed. And there was a lot of media attention at that time. What got much less media attention was a bill that John Hostetler introduced into Congress. Hostetler is a Republican from Indiana. He authored an amendment that ruled that no federal dollars could be used to remove the Ten Commandments monument from the Alabama Supreme Court. The bill was meaningless in one sense. The monument was removed, but it was a way of affirming biblical law. The Hostetler Amendment actually passed. It passed on July 23, 2003, by a vote of 260 to 161. This vote doesn't mean 260 representatives are Dominionists. They probably don't even know what the term means. But it does demonstrate the ability of Dominionist legislators to win support for their bills. This flyer claims that if people vote Democrat, the Bible will be banned. Look at the address on the envelope. It wasn't sent out by some fringe group. It was sent out by the Republican National Committee. The Republican Party of Texas affirms that the United States is a Christian nation. The Texas GOP platform pledges to exert its influence to dispel the myth of the separation of church and state. We oppose the legalization of sodomy. So how did we get here? We're going to begin this history in 1964, the year Barry Goldwater lost his bid for president on the Republican ticket. Barry Goldwater has nothing to do with the religious right. He's just your good old-fashioned conservative. He's spoken out strongly against religious extremism in the Republican Party. But a group of Republican strategists who had worked on Goldwater's '64 campaign decided they needed to expand the base of the Republican Party, which was too narrow. One of the people who had worked on his campaign was Republican strategist Paul Weyrich. In 1973, Weyrich founded the Heritage Foundation, a think tank to promote the ideas of Weyrich's new group. He wanted to expand the base of the Republican Party, so he proposed targeting members of fundamentalist, Pentecostal, and charismatic churches. Not all members of these churches support Dominionism, and probably haven't even heard of it, but those were the groups targeted by the political strategists. In '79, Weyrich coined the term moral majority, which became a major organization with Jerry Falwell at the helm. The moral majority registered 3 million new voters to the Republican Party in 1980, which is curious, because many of those voters didn't match the socioeconomic profile of Republicans. The party represented the interests of the very wealthy and the Southern segregationists. People tend to vote their socioeconomic interests. So how do you get people to vote against their own interests? Weyrich said in a speech in 1980, "We are talking about Christianizing America. We're talking about simply spreading the gospel in a political context." Those two sentences are the seeds of Dominionism, Christianizing America in a political context. The moral majority disbanded in 1989, the same year the Christian Coalition formed. And this brings us to Pat Robertson, founder of the Christian Coalition. You may remember that Pat Robertson ran for president in 1988 in the Republican primaries. He lost, but he beat Vice President George Bush, the father, in the Iowa caucuses. How did he do that? He decided to take over the Republican Party from the bottom up. His organization worked precinct by precinct to take over the party leadership at the local level. Christian Coalition's executive director, Ralph Reed, said, "We think the Lord is going to give us this nation back one precinct at a time, one neighborhood at a time, and one state at a time." Ralph Reed said that he received his political training at meetings of an organization called the Council for National Policy. ABC News reported on the council, "Vast right-wing cabal meet the most powerful group you've never heard of." That's because they've been meeting in strictest secrecy since 1983. The Reverend Tim LaHaye co-founded the Council for National Policy with the idea of bringing together hardcore religious leaders with far-right politicians such as Jesse Helms and Washington insiders. He also included the biggest financial backers of extreme right-wing causes. These people planned and carried out the political strategies of the Dominionist movement. Robertson said to the Denver Post in '92, We want as soon as possible to see a majority of the Republican Party in the hands of pro-family Christians. While their candidates stayed out of the limelight, Christian Coalition campaigned on their behalf exclusively in fundamentalist, Pentecostal, and charismatic churches. By election time in 1994, Christian Coalition had distributed 40 million voter guides in more than 100,000 churches nationwide. And that was a watershed year in this country. That year, Republicans won majorities in both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years. Time magazine was aware of the event. They credited the Christian Coalition with giving the Republicans these successes, calling Ralph Reed the right hand of God. In 2000, 70 million voter guides were sent out to support George Bush. George W. Bush kicked off his candidacy for the president in 1999 by meeting with the Council for National Policy. They must have decided he was one of them, because leaders like Robertson and Falwell marshaled massive resources to support his presidency. Pat Robertson based his work on two simple words: voter apathy. He wrote in 1990, "With the apathy that exists today, a well-organized minority can influence the selection of candidates to an astonishing degree." Voter apathy has worked well for the Dominionists. Something else that's worked well for the Dominionists is voter ignorance. The media, even the liberal press, has had a real blind spot to the rise of Dominionism in government. But that may be changing now. There are many wonderful organizations working to wake up the public to extremism and intolerance in government. I'm convinced that most people would not support a Dominionist agenda if they understood it. Their candidates have to use stealth. And a government run on the principles of Dominion theology would not tolerate other belief systems, because there's only one truth. There's no room for the kind of tolerance and diversity that makes our country a great nation. I believe the majority of people in this country value its diversity and will make good political choices when they are informed. We'll conclude with a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote when he was President of the United States to explain the meaning of the First Amendment. He wrote this letter to the Danbury Baptist Association to reassure them that in this new country they would be free to practice their religion. "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, I contemplate with solemn reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state."